morning, everyone, and welcome to the H-Prize General Overview and Q&A webinar. My name is Chris Worth, and I am the organizer for this meeting. We'll begin shortly, but first I have a few housekeeping items to tell you about. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slides, will be posted to the H-Prize website in about 10 days. We will send out an email to attendees once those are posted to the site. All attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar, so please submit your questions via the questions box that you should see on your webinar panel. We will cover those questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. With that, I would like to introduce our DOE host, Sarah Studer, joining us from the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, D.C. Sarah is an ORISE Fellow in the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. Good morning, Sarah.
Good afternoon for those of us on the East Coast, and thanks for that introduction, Chris. As Chris noted, I'm an ORISE Fellow in the Fuel Cell Technologies Office, and I've been working to support the H-Prize here in the office along with Katie Randolph, who's a technology manager in the Fuel Cell Technology Office. She's not able to join us today, but I'll be giving you an overview of, brief overview and introduction to the H-Prize before turning it over to Manuel Wagner, who's from the Hydrogen Education Foundation, which is the administrator of the prize. Also joining us on the phone to help answer some questions towards the end is Chris Ainscoe from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is doing some of the technical data collection for the competition. So we're definitely ready and anxious to hear your questions. And so I will just now get started because I'd like to tell you about H2 Refuel. It's a $1 million competition to spur innovation and support hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. So as many of you may know, fuel cell electric vehicles that run on hydrogen are actually here. It's a very exciting time to be in this area. They've moved from the auto shows into our driveways and are starting to arrive for consumers in limited markets. Some of them have started leasing the vehicles in California as of last year, so those are already publicly available. Others are currently in auto shows, and there's been another car announced for commercial sale in the U.S. later this year. And not only are they, apparently, there we go. Not only are they on the roads in California, there was actually one here at the Department of Energy earlier this year. Unfortunately, I can't share the video with you because videos and the GoToMeeting webinars tend to not get along. But if you want to see a video of Secretary Ernest Moniz driving a hydrogen-powered fuel cell electric vehicle, you can check out that web link that I've posted below on this website. So now that we have cars available, if you can go to the next slide, the big question is hydrogen infrastructure. And most people don't realize that we already have about 1,500 miles of hydrogen pipeline in the U.S. We already produce more than 9 million metric tons of hydrogen per year, though that doesn't all go to fueling. There are currently about 50 hydrogen fueling stations across the country, of which 10 are public. And there are several states with hydrogen infrastructure development plans underway. California has planned $100 million through 2023 for hydrogen infrastructure development with a goal of 100 public stations. Hawaii has committed to public access for refueling infrastructure on Oahu by 2020. And there are Northeast states such as Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut that have preliminary plans to develop hydrogen infrastructure and deploy fuel cell electric vehicles in their metro centers. There's also an 8-state MOU in place to increase the share of alternative fuel automobiles in transportation. They have committed to put 3.5 million zero-emission vehicles, such as electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, on the roads by 2025. But even with all of this activity, the station rollout is going to take time, and that's where H2 Refuel comes in, with the idea to help support hydrogen fueling stations, hydrogen fueling options during the commercial station rollout. So if you go to the next slide, H2 Refuel is the second H-Prize competition. It's administered by the Hydrogen Education Foundation, as I mentioned a minute ago, and they will be presenting the main part of this webinar shortly. H2 Refuel challenges America's innovators, engineers, and really anybody interested in hydrogen energy technologies to develop on-site systems to generate and dispense hydrogen at places like homes, community centers, or small businesses to fuel vehicles. These systems would use resources that are already commonly delivered to residents and businesses, electricity and natural gas, for example, to produce the hydrogen. The competition opened this past October and will last about 2 years. We're currently in this first year when people interested in competing can look for partners, start making plans, and prepare to submit information for judging by the end of October 2015. I'll talk more about the next steps in a moment, but I want to draw your attention to the website, hydrogenprize.org. This is the best place to find out more information about the website. You can find the guidelines, details on the registration process, a page to help potential competitors find others interested in teaming up, and more. Manuel will be going through that in more detail, but I wanted to start with an introduction. Now, for all of these systems, and you can head to the next page, the idea is that there are base criteria that all of the systems are going to need to meet, such as meeting relevant safety codes and standards, having certain usability criteria. And then there's actually also two categories of systems. So there's a smaller scale for single user places, like a small home system, something that you could put in a garage in your family home. And these systems with only 1 or 2 users would be able to have longer refueling times, say overnight. And then there's a second category, the community scale. This would be something that would be installed in, say, an apartment community at a small business that has a small fleet of vehicles. And these would be for multiple users, so that it could be somewhere that would need to have shorter refueling times, but be able to produce more hydrogen. Now, in both cases, the systems must generate hydrogen and dispense it to vehicles. Now going through the timeline, as I said, contestants will have until October of this year to make their plans, register, and submit their information. After the October submission, a panel of judges will evaluate the submissions and select entries to go to the finalist phase. These finalists will be announced in December, and they'll have about 7 months to get their systems up and running before testing begins in the summer of 2016. That's when, at that point, technical and financial data will be collected to determine the winner. During this time, there will also be a chance for the public and media to get a peek at these systems during an open house. The testing phase will end on October 31st, 2016. After that, the data will be analyzed to determine the winner, and the anticipated announcement of the winner is for December 2016. We can head to the next slide. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Emmanuel Wagner to tell you more about the H2 Refuel H Prize. Thank you very much. And over to you, Emmanuel.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Chris. And also a warm welcome from my side to this H2 Refuel H Prize overview webinar. I'm Emmanuel Wagner. I work for the Hydrogen Education Foundation. And if you're not familiar with the HEF, it is a charitable nonprofit organization that promotes clean hydrogen energy technologies. And we do that by being involved in innovative national competitions, organizing events, and developing educational programs that encourage environmental stewardship, help improve energy security, and create green jobs. And if you're interested in more in the work that we're doing, just take a look at hydrogeneducationfoundation.org. Next slide. So as Sarah mentioned, my part here is to cover the rules and guidelines in more detail, and you should definitely take a very close look at the complete set of those documents at the link shown up here. If you're interested in participating, you really need to take time to review those documentation in order to develop your system. I also want to take this time a second to emphasize that if there's anything said or shown in this presentation that contradicts the rules and guidelines, it is the rules and guidelines that actually take precedence over this presentation. All right, so the rules and guidelines cover a wealth of information, as you can see here under the bullet points, and I will cover each of these points individually. So that is the design submission. I'll talk about what basic criteria need to be met, how finalists are determined, what to look at regarding safety, regarding their location of the system, what to take into account regarding data collection, how finalists are determined, and what the scoring criteria and judging will look like. Also, while it is obvious, I just want to make sure it's said that failure to comply with the rules and guidelines will result in disqualification of the contestant. Next slide. All right. All contestants will be required to provide a design submission that will demonstrate the ability of the system to meet the base criteria. That submission is due by October 29th of 2015. The submission is required to include, but is not limited to, the concept of the design, a safety analysis, and a written confirmation of the system location, including site permits. So, and additional instructions we'll post on the HPRIZE website detailing that additional required information. Next slide. All right, the base criteria. The base criteria basically establish which of the design submissions will be considered to be eligible. We'll have a panel of judges that will review the submissions and determine if there's enough convincing evidence that the submission can satisfy these base criteria. And then the judges will select from these eligible submissions the best entries, which will become the finalists and proceed to system development and the testing phase. And so let me take a little bit of time here to go into some detail on these criteria, since they're very important. First of all systems for home or community use must dispense hydrogen at a minimum of 350 bar. Failure to meet that will basically, your system will not, your submission will not advance. Then, depending on whether the system is designed for a home or community use, both maximum dispensing time and the minimum number of standard fills per day will vary. A standard fill here is equal to about 1 kilogram of dispensed hydrogen. The main differences between a home community system and a home and the community system lie in those two categories, because at home people generally have all night, for example, to refuel their vehicles, similar to how electric vehicles are charged. However, at the community refueling system, people may have more severe time constraints, which means that the community refueling will, and it also means that community refueling systems will get more than a single user per day. So it'll just be necessary for that system to be able to handle just more throughput. And with these differences in mind, you can imagine that that actually translates into differences for the costs of the systems. And I'll go into those details a little bit later. A little bit more on what other codes and standards to meet. The purity of hydrogen must meet that of SAE J2719, and the fill method must be compliant with the relevant codes and standards and must not exceed the safe parameters of pressure and temperature for the vehicle storage tank to be filled. Also, all relevant codes and standards, since they may vary by location and design, must be met. So you need to make sure that you take that into consideration for the development of your submission. And furthermore, the systems also must meet the relevant usability criteria. And that kind of means that, of course, the system has to be reliable. And when it's installed at the selected location, the system needs to be easily used by the average user with minimal training and time. And that's, I think, is pretty obvious. All right, next slide. So the finalists. Once the proposal deadline has passed, all the entered system, as I mentioned earlier, will be evaluated by the panel of experts who will determine whether or not the system is likely to meet the reasonable safety, cost, and usability criteria. The judges will also select from these eligible submissions the best entries, and only those will be declared finalists by approximately December of 2015, and then proceed to the system development and testing phase. And at that point, the finalists will have about 7 months to complete their systems. Next slide. Safety is of high priority to the competition. So I can't emphasize that enough. All systems must abide by all relevant safety codes and standards. and they may vary based on the installation location and the design parameters. Some relevant information on safety codes and issues we've put here under this link, and further details on safety will be provided during a webinar that we will conduct in approximately in the month of August. Next slide, please. All right, the system location. The system has to be located within one of the 50 states of the United States and or the District of Columbia. And all sites must have sufficient access for data collection teams, as well as enough room for a remote monitoring equipment. So you need to take that into account for your footprint. And the site must also be accessible by the press and the public for at least a single one-day open house. Next slide, please. All right, data collection. So the competition is really truly begins once we have the build systems, and at that time the data acquisition begins. Data will be collected over a period of about 2 to 3 months, and we'll collect no more than 60 days worth of operational data from any one system. There will be at least one on-site test for each system, and the information about data collection requirements and the webinar detailing the data collection we have provided here under these links. The webinar we held about a month ago, and you should definitely take a look at that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a number of charts, and these charts outline the data collection requirements for the systems. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because of the webinar that we've held previously. All I'm going to say is that this chart is displaying what is being measured and how it is being measured, along with a few other things. For example, if you have really good eyes, you can see that. For example, for dispensing pressure, you'll see that it's measured for both system types, and the signal range must reach 125% of the maximum design system dispensing pressure. The units must be in bar, and so forth. So that details all of those specific criteria. Again, there's a lot of detail here, and you should really take a very careful look at these charts, which are located at the link that you can see below. If you advance the slides, you'll see this chart, which you'll see this chart, which outlines the bonus criteria, and the bonus criteria are hot water, space heating, and electricity generation. And I will go into more detail on those a little later on. The technical data collected from the systems will be based upon these charts and will be used for an objective judging of the systems. All right, next slide. The scoring criteria. Some of the criteria are considered more critical than others, and so there is a weighing factor that is applied to them, as you can see here in this table. The systems will be evaluated. Excuse me. The systems will be evaluated on the basis of both cost and technical criteria, and the criteria are scored from 1 to 5, where 5 is the best for that category. Which means that if you calculate everything together, the maximum score that any system could achieve is 50 before applying the bonus criteria. Next slide. Okay, so the technical and cost criteria. Let me explain that for a second. As a reference, you can basically say higher scores are provided for higher performing systems. A total installed system cost will be based on the actual cost for the system equipment, which would include the balance of plant and up to the nozzle interface, as well as the actual installation costs divided by the amount of hydrogen produced per day in kilogram. Furthermore, the direct user cost per kilogram will be based on feedstock inputs, operation and maintenance costs during the testing period, and will be divided by the amount of hydrogen that is produced and used. Then we have dispensing pressure, which refers to the pressure of hydrogen that is dispensed to the vehicle. And here the minimum is, again, 350 bar. The dispensing time would be the time required to dispense a standard fill of hydrogen to a vehicle, including the time required to connect the system to the vehicle and to begin the hydrogen flow. And the standard fill, again, is 1 kilogram of hydrogen. The standard fill per day will be based on the highest number of actual or simulated fills that is completed in a 24-hour period. And then we have availability. And the availability will be tested over a period of 2 to 3 months, during which system usage will need to be at least 50% of planned capacity per week. And any time spent on repairs or on non-routine maintenance during the testing period will count as non-available, even if it's compensated for at another time. All right, continue. So the bonus criteria I mentioned earlier, the systems that provide heat, power, and or hot water in addition to hydrogen for fueling will be awarded bonus points, which you see outlined here. And as long as these bonus systems or these bonus systems satisfy the requirement for a bonus category, it will be rewarded 1 point for each category. If a system meets all 3 of those categories, there's a theoretical maximum score of a system of 53 points. Next slide. Because this is a little bit abstract, I'm providing here an example of how scoring would work. So this is the basic minimum, a basic minimum for a home system. It has received the lowest marks for all categories and completed no bonus objectives, and therefore led to a score of 10. And basically, the scores are simply the addition of all the weighing factors for each category. If you go to the next slide, you'll see another example, which is more realistic. Here we have a home system which has mixed scores from all categories. For example, the dispensing pressure is 475 bar, which would, according to the criteria we've just outlined in previous slides, would achieve 2 points. And then we have apply the score multiplier by it, which ends up for a total score for dispensing pressure of 6 points. And the same continues on. The time to dispense 1 kilogram of hydrogen is 3 hours, which gives it a score of 3. The weighing factor is only 1, so it ends up with a total score of 3 for that category. We have tested availability of the system at 88%, which is a score of 2. Here we have a weighing factor of 2, which amounts to a score of 4. The system installation cost is $18,000 per kilogram dispensed per day, which is a score of 2. Again, this is a category, a full total points of 4 in that category. The direct user cost is $11 per kilogram, which is good, and translates to a point of 4, a score of 4. And the system supplies hot water, so there's 1 bonus point awarded. If you count all of those different scores together, the system achieves 25 points in total. And so basically that's how those systems are going to achieve their points in the end. And on the next slide you'll see how we'll evaluate the systems, because the scores will be calculated by an independent panel of judges that is assembled by the DOE in consultation with HEF. The judges will be selected from relevant organizations or government entities. We'll also have all technical data collected by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. In addition to that, we'll also have an independent auditing entity that will be tasked with collecting all financial information from the competitors to determine the associated system costs. Next slide. All right. So you've heard a lot about the contest. Now, how do you actually participate? First of all, you really do have to register, which you can do by going to the link on the bottom, or to go to the website hprize.org and go to the drop-down panel for competitors, and then under registration. Instructions on how to register and what is needed to do so are on that website, and I'll explain that shortly. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk about who can actually participate, because it's not open for everyone. You have to be, well, actually you can be an individual, a single entity, or a team. A team may consist of 2 or more individuals or entities, or a combination of those two. But individuals have to either be citizens or permanent residents of the United States. And entities have to be organized or incorporated in the United States and have to have their primary place of business in the United States as well. Only then they can compete. Also, some of the documentation that is required for a successful registration needs to be notarized and sent to us by mail. So we therefore encourage all potential contestants to start the registration process early on and not last minute. All the relevant statuses of the competitors must be maintained for the duration of the competition. So the company can't move out of the country at some point during it. A contestant may also not be a federal entity or a federal employee acting within his or her employment scope, nor may a contestant be a national laboratory employee acting within the scope of his or her employment. More information and more details on the guidelines are provided in the guidelines, so you need to take a look at them very closely. Next slide. The competition contestants must sign a waiver of claims against the federal government, and they have to choose a single team leader who will be the sole contact for H-Prize officials. Only that person will receive correspondence. Contestants may be a part, or contestants may actually compete in different teams, in multiple teams, but all affiliations must be disclosed to each team. Of course, a team roster has to be submitted by each team to the HEF and DOE. All right, next slide. Out here, looking for a team. It is very easy actually to get involved with the H-Prize contest. So if you're looking to form a team or to find a team, you just go to the link listed here, and it will allow you to basically sign up and share that with other contestants, or for you to look at other contestants that are looking for teams. And you'll see some of those. Yeah, you'll see some of those down here. Basically, yeah, go to this site and fill out the right-hand side slide. Interested in joining a team, fill it out, and you'll be added to the website. Next slide will explain what you actually get for registration, because it's not only that you're as a registrant you can compete. There are actually more benefits. For example, on the H-Prize website, you're able to develop a devoted web page which you can use to display any information about your team. For example, your team roster, your team bio, notable accomplishments. You can include your Facebook feed, or just about anything that you see fit. We'll also make H-Prize updates directly available to the team, and we think it's a great way for those contestants to get some promotional value. Next slide. One item I have to make sure is addressed. All IP rights, all intellectual property rights belong to the contestant following the completion of the competition. So no organization or persons associated with the contest will make any IP claims towards the contestant systems. However, contestants are liable for all costs associated with competing unless that is stated otherwise. The Department of Energy, H-Prize, the Hydrogen Education Foundation, and or any other sponsoring or supporting organizations assume no liability for accidents or injuries incurred as a result of the competition of competing in the H-Prize contest. Next slide. All right, here all the aforementioned information and more is located on the H-Prize website. You can follow all of those links here. You should definitely take a look at the frequently asked questions, which will also be updated following the completion of this webinar. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook for additional information and updates. Next slide. So now that you've learned all about the H-Prize contest and you kind of heard how to compete, it's time now for your Q&A, for our Q&A session. So you should definitely type any questions you may have into the question and answer box, which is located in the control panel to your right-hand side. If you have questions later on, you can, of course, send them also to us, or you can tweet them to H2Refuel. That concludes my part of the presentation, and I'll hand it back to Sarah for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And we already have some questions, so thank you for everybody who has asked questions already. And I just want to say we may not get to all of your questions. After this, there will be some information on how to directly ask us questions if you have things that maybe are too complicated to ask here, or there's too many details you don't want to share on this public forum. And if we don't get to your questions, we're going to put all of the FAQs up on the website, and we'll try to follow up on all of the questions that we don't get to, either on the FAQ site or perhaps the questions that come in here do have your names attached, so we can follow up with you if we don't get a chance to answer. I'm going to start with a question. There's two related questions to this. And so the first question is, will a fuel cell vehicle be available for my system to fill for the system testing phase? The HEF or DOE will not be providing vehicles for teams to use. There may be other places you can get vehicles, but this leads into a question somebody else asked, which is what a simulated fill is. And this is a way to not do if there isn't a vehicle. So I just kind of wanted to bounce that maybe to Chris. He might be able to fill that in a little bit more.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. So recognizing that fuel cell vehicles are somewhat of a rare commodity, and as Sarah said, we won't be providing them. We will make available a simulated fill protocol so that contestants can simulate a number of fills in order to exercise their station as though there were an actual vehicle filling. So, and those will count toward the number of fills per day toward that criterion.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, then starting from the top. One question is, would public commercial hydrogen fueling stations co-located at gasoline stations be eligible? And this may depend partly on what the design is, but in general, the intent for the H-Prize, the H2Refuel, is not for commercial fueling stations. It's for small-scale fueling that could be installed at a home or like a small, somewhere like a community center, an apartment building kind of thing. So there's something that was mentioned was a usability criteria if you look at the guidelines. And this is part of this gets at whether these systems could be installed at locations like single residences, if you're talking about the home system, or community locations like, you know, apartment buildings or small businesses, which aren't expected to be a fueling station as much as a small business that maybe has a few vehicles that they want to run on hydrogen. So it would probably depend on the specific design, but that's not the expected target for this competition. Okay. Does the cost of water usage enter into the judging criteria?
Right.
Just identified for electricity and natural gas to make sure everybody's on a level playing field for that. Another question. So one question, I think this will go over to Chris. What are accepted methods for measuring hydrogen purity?
So hydrogen purity, there's a SAE standard that's in place. It's SAE J2719. And there are a couple of labs in the country who are able to measure to that level of purity, and they have a number of ways to do that. Measuring to that level of purity is actually rather difficult. So if you refer to the webinar we did about a month ago on the measurement methods, which has been posted and recorded, you'll see some details about how that's supposed to proceed. But in short, basically, the contestants need to have a contract with one of these labs to come out and have them take samples from the system. The samples need to remain in the custody of the labs and never in the custody of the contestant. And then the sample results need to be mailed directly to NREL rather than to the contestant. So it's like getting your college transcript. It needs to come to us. So that's the short story.
Great, thank you. Okay, sorry. Now there's a bunch of questions coming in, so I'll have to catch up on them. So there's a question about the permits. Do the permits submitted have to be approved? What exactly is expected? This is mainly a question that I'm going to suggest you come up during the safety webinar that'll be in August. And I think that will give a much better idea of what exactly is expected. And if you have more questions, that's one that I'd suggest sending an email to through the website or to the email address that's going to be noted in a minute once we're closing. And let's see. So a question that maybe Emmanuel can help with is whether we can throw some light on the previous awards and the information about the past awards, and I'm assuming this is about the H prize, since I said this was the second H prize competition.
Yeah, correct. And the answer to that is the previous H prize competition that concluded several years ago did not actually have a winner. None of the submissions that we've received actually require or fulfilled the requirements of that competition. So there were no awards for that previous H prize. Regarding information about the previous H prize, that's a good question. I would have to follow up on that because there's no information on the current H prize website, so I would have to dig around a little bit for that. But I'd be happy to include that in the follow-up.
Okay, thank you. And another question, perhaps, Manuel, that you could answer is, will a prize be given to the best home system and the best community category? And if not, how do you decide which one will win?
Yeah, actually, very, very good question. So there will be one award, and so it would either be a home system or a community system, and it is determined by basically the judging panel and the scoring of the competing top systems. So sadly, we're not going to be able to make two awards available for, or one for each system. It is the best system that is determined by the judges, as well as the technical and data collection.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, looking at the questions. Next question. Another question is about systems that have been designed and built prior to October 29th, 2015. This is the deadline for the information submission, whether these systems would be eligible if they've already been built by 2015. And this question has come up before, and there's nothing that excludes that. The intent is, you know, something that's better than had been the status quo, but it should be noted that if some part of the system is already built, the same requirements for having all of the information available about things like bill of materials, information like that, would still be required. All of the rest of the requirements would be in place even if it's already been built. Another question, and I think this goes to Emmanuel, is how long is the registration process? How early should people start that process if they want to qualify in time for the deadlines at the end of October?
Right. So the registration process by itself, if you have the materials available, doesn't take all that long. Depending on if you're an entity or an individual, you may need to submit certain documentation that need to be notarized, as I mentioned earlier. So since they're notarized documents, you can't just fax them over. So you actually have to mail them here, which, you know, if you count for that, it'll take at least a couple of days. Also, the registration process doesn't take that much time. However, because some of the materials, like you know, where like a notarized copy of the passport and stuff like that, or you know, the forms of incorporation for an entity, may take a little bit of time to get. I would recommend really starting the registration process as early as possible. There's nothing really that prevents you, and then submit the materials when you have them. You know, or basically, yeah, submit the materials with them, and don't wait until the end, because there's postal service involved and all of that. You really don't want to, you know, push your luck on the deadline. So the earlier you get registered, the better that is for you.
Great, and we have a clarification on the water question, or at least a follow-up, and this actually came in from a couple separate people. So I'm going to generalize the question, and that is whether, since there's going to be differences in local rates, whether there would be something the same way that electricity and natural gas has a standard value, whether there would be a standard value for water, and if so, when would you know that precise cost? And this is something that that would be determined later, and along with the entity that will do that, and the evaluation of the cost. And as noted in the guidelines, more details on the cost, the information about the cost requirements and things like that, and what data would need to be provided, would be available once the finalists have been selected. So I think that should answer both separate questions. And will submissions to the prize be in the public domain? Emmanuel, is that something you can answer?
Sure. So the submissions themselves will not be, as they're submitted, will not be in the public domain. We did talk about a summary of the design that would be made available, and Sarah, now I'm kind of is that the end of it? That what we would make available? Is basically sort of an executive summary.
So there will definitely be information about them made available. That's the whole idea of having like an open house. But the data, like you were saying, for the submission wouldn't be done. And if the question about public domain is for like IP issues, as Emmanuel pointed out, the IP stays with the people who make the system.
Yeah,
so that's what the public domain means.
Yeah, so if I can jump in here, Sarah, I think if I can read into the questioner's mind, they might be asking whether a submission counts as a public disclosure, which starts the one-year clock running for applying for a patent. And I'd say they probably need to talk to their own legal counsel about that, whether that counts as public disclosure or not.
Yeah, that would, okay, great. So hopefully one of those sets of answers answer the question. Another question that is probably for Chris is there a manual for the connections to the telemetry device available?
Not yet.
I'm assuming that's the data collection telemetry device.
Yeah, so there's not a manual available yet. The data collection device is still we have a test device that we're building and working on, so we don't have a hookup diagram yet, but we will. Again, for details to that, I would refer you to the webinar we did in May, which had a lot of detail about what types of signals the DCS, the data collection system, will take, and what kind of signals and what kind of data and how it's scaled. So in short, will be a mix of data provided by the contestants' PLC over Modbus and direct wire sensors directly into the DCS. So refer to that webinar, and if you have any questions after that, go ahead and submit a question into the hprize@ee.doe.gov.
Great, and a follow-up, since not everybody here probably was on that, and something that Emmanuel had brought up. How big is this device? What kind of footprint are we talking about?
So the DCS?
Yes.
The size of a microwave, probably. So again, it's still a little bit TBD. So I reserve the right to change that, but think of the size of a microwave. Some of that will depend on the location that the contestant has available to put it, and whether it's located in a Class 1 Div 2 Group B area and has to be in an explosion-proof container or not. So some of that will depend on the installation location. But
great. Thank you. And then a question that came into the earlier webinar on data collection that we held off on because it wasn't about data collection, and similar questions have come into the email box, is what about feedstocks besides natural gas and electricity, or inputs besides electricity and natural gas? And the goal of this is to develop systems that can be widely used in locations like homes, community centers, businesses. So the idea is that the resources for the systems must be commonly available at residences for it to be acceptable for the competition. So something like a chemical feedstock that you don't normally find in homes at the needed quantity, something like methanol would not qualify. But if there are resources that really are at pretty much all homes, that would be considered, and the judging process would probably apply the usability criteria. So something like using sunlight for solar energy might be acceptable if the entire system would be feasible in most places. So it doesn't have an excessively large footprint to be able to run the system. It could actually be used in most parts of the country. And this would be part of that usability criteria. And then, but the other important note is that all costs associated with getting and using that resource would be included in the calculations for the cost criteria. Okay, back to the webinar questions, and I think this goes to Chris again. Does each fill have to be a minimum of 350 bar state of charge, or is the station's ability to fill at 350 bar the line to meet the scoring?
So you need to do standard fills. Standard fill is 1 kilogram. So as far as how big the state of charge is, that's measured relative to 1 kilogram. The pressure that the system is able to achieve is really a separate criterion. That makes sense.
Great. And and again, if you want follow-up questions and we don't get to them, please send an email and we'll have that on the next slide very soon. Okay, trying to get the other questions. Okay, so we have a follow-up question, I think, from the public domain, and that is, can we, the webinar participants, access the other submissions of the other participants after the deadline? Emmanuel? I think.
Yeah, so the submissions won't be available for webinar participants before or after the deadline.
Great.
So that's a will not. Yeah.
Right. Okay, and then a question about the costs is that the installation and production costs are going to vary depending on whether the technology is at prototype stage or a large volume production, and how is that factored into the cost criteria. Emmanuel, do you want to field this, or I want me to?
I think we've had a similar question before. If you want to tackle that, I'd be more comfortable with that.
Right. So for the competition, the idea is how the cost criteria is based on the actual entry system. So it's about that individual system. It's not projected at larger volume. So it's whatever the costs are for that actual system that is the entry into the competition. Okay.
Yeah.
And, okay, so some other questions that have been asked both here and otherwise is about systems using renewable systems, about whether there are score multipliers for using renewable energy systems. And as I noted a few minutes ago, if you want to use a system that uses solar power that's on site, you're certainly welcome to do that, and it would all of the system costs would be wrapped up into it. And a well-to-wheels analysis has shown that even hydrogen generated from natural gas without any carbon capture provides greenhouse gas emission reductions compared to the current vehicles. And so since the goal is to develop systems that can be installed in most places in the US, we're looking for things that are accessible to most residential locations, and that's the primary focus. Great. And then it looks like we are running out of new questions. So, so we're going to, if some more late questions come in, we'll try to follow up with those either one-on-one or put them up on the FAQ. And I think that at this point I need to pass it over to Chris Worth for some final notes, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. We really appreciate this, and definitely use the website information. That's a great place to go for these questions, and you'll also be able to find ways to ask your questions using that hydrogenprize.org website and the information here. So I'm going to just turn it over to Chris Worth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and also thank you to Emmanuel and Chris for putting on a great presentation. That's going to conclude our webinar today. If we didn't get to your question again, please feel free to email the HPrize address shown on the screen. That's hprize@ee.doe.gov. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining in. Remind you that the webinar and slides will be available online at the HPrize website. The slides should be up in about 2 days, and the webinar recording should be available in about 10 days. So check back in to catch those. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.
Very good. Goodbye.